This is Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. When I think about the critical issues facing Black and Brown residents in the St. Louis area, I often ask the questions: how did we get here? What's holding us back? And how do we progress? At 9 PBS, we want to deepen our understanding and change the narrative. Join me as I look for answers and discover solutions on today's podcast. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the death of Michael Brown Jr. Today, I sit down with a man who was in the center of the aftermath. Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson is the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, but he co-chaired the Ferguson Commission, which released the report, Forward Through Ferguson, A Path Toward Racial Equity. So how far has the region progressed? What lessons and scars did he take from his work here? And why does he believe child well-being and racial justice are forever intertwined? Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson on whether we are failing Black children. That's next on Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel.
Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center, the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and Orvin and Latrice Kimbrough.
Welcome back to another episode of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. And we thank you so much to those of you who have subscribed thus far and those of you who are sharing this podcast. I am told that it is eliciting a lot of emotions and that many of you are learning a great deal. Well, we are then doing our job. The other thing we want to do is to change the narrative of St. Louis, change the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And that happens, I believe, through information and conversation. So I have instructions for you, as I always do. The 3 S's. I want you to subscribe, to share, and to say something. Maybe that's 4 S's. So it's easy to subscribe. Just hit that button. You become a subscriber. Share. That's right in the middle. There's a little arrow. Click share, and you can send it to somebody via text. You can email the podcast to someone, even share it to yourself. I do that often. And then we want you to say something. Leave us a comment. I have thick skin. My husband would disagree with that, but I have thick skin. So let us know what you think. I want to hear what these conversations are doing to your spirit. I want to know. So go to 9pbs.org/Listen St. Louis and leave a comment, and we will react to every single one of them. I am overjoyed about this conversation today because he is, I would say, back home, not from St. Louis, but he made a mark on St. Louis, and we miss you still, Reverend Starsky Wilson. Welcome back.
Glad to be here. I miss y'all too.
Well, by the time this happens, you will have spoken at Webster University at the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Conference. But before we get to that, certainly I want to talk about Ferguson.
Sure.
And tell me if you left here with scars or you left here with lessons from the Ferguson Uprising?
Yeah, so I left St. Louis in December. I started at the Children's Defense Fund December 7th, 2020, and I left with both lessons and scars. My prayer is that I get to work now from my lessons, get to work from my scars, and not from my wounds. Mm-hmm. The reality is we always can pick up things. I learned things about policy. I learned things about power building in the context of the uprising. I tell people a lot, I was dramatically and deeply radicalized by young people in that moment. And I take all of that with me into the service to Children's Defense Fund and everything else I do. I took that into the work that I did at Deaconess Foundation. So yeah, I absolutely leave with those lessons, and I leave hopefully with scars. I think I was here long enough to do work, to learn on one side, to build enough relationships and trust to be able to do hopefully some valuable work in the midst of the uprising, to learn enough in that context, to then be able to also serve in a way that was helpful, but not to jump out of community immediately following. So when I say that I leave with scars versus wounds, wounds are open many times, and we've not yet healed from them. Scars remind us of where those wounds have been, but they have had some time to heal. And so I had some time to heal after that. had some time to work with people to rebuild and build some things that the community needed before, and I carry it with me, both the relationships and the lessons at every turn.
Some scars are visible. I have one over my left eyebrow. If you want to hear the story, ask me. Some scars are visible and some are not. Where are we today? What has changed? What needs to change? And that was like 5 questions in one. I understand that.
Yeah. No, I think there are marks that we continue to see in the St. Louis region, and frankly, let me be very clear. As someone who hadn't lived it for 3 years, there's some things that I don't see.
For sure.
But I think there are things that we see on a national landscape that can be attributed to the work here, to the people here, in ways that are gifts and graces for the rest of the nation. Number one, I think we see the marks of leadership from young people having transformed narratives and transformed the nation. I come into contact with people across the country who not only had touch points here and had their lives changed, had their ministries redirected, had their orientations around profession shifted by the moment of the uprising, and especially now, even as people have conversations about Palestine, they remember their first politicization around these issues in the context of the Ferguson uprising. And so that is something that Ferguson has left a mark in. We also have to recall in the context of history that the uprising and that sustained mobilization over the course of the year was really the first national mobilization of what came to be called the Movement for Black Lives. A concept began to get its life and its legs here in the St. Louis metropolitan region. And so these are things that the landscape has been littered with conversations and with leaders who were impacted by this moment. And so it has absolutely shifted that. And of course, we see the mark of those leaders still on the ground here with new expressions, organizations that have been built and have held folks accountable around the work that we sought to do in the midst of that uprising. It is definitely something that changed individuals and changed institutions, but absolutely changed the national politic and landscape around power building as well.
There was backlash, and there has always been backlash in this country when Black people try to assert themselves in whatever the arena is, whatever the industry is.
That's right.
By the time this airs, you will have spoken, as I mentioned, at Webster University to their annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference, and you are going to talk about the backlash against DEI and its impact on students.
Yeah. Interestingly, one of the things I talk to people about a lot is learning the lessons of the Ferguson uprising. By the time we passed Senate Bill 5, where we were trying to create police accountability here, the next session, within a year, the legislature was working to tear it apart. By the time we were advancing and building a movement for Black and brown young people with young Black queer leadership at the fore, the police associations were raising more money than they ever had, and across the country there were 30 states that implemented laws to strengthen the power and authority of police. And so it goes back to what King talked about in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, that even amongst those who are moderate and advancing and standing with Black people, they're all about treating Black people decently, but not necessarily equally. And so we begin to see a white backlash in all of those. I wish people paid attention to what was happening in Ferguson so they wouldn't be so surprised about what's happening post George Floyd. I wish people paid attention to those years, which came, 6 years before, so they weren't surprised when they saw people pulling back from DEI investments or announcing them quickly and pulling them back so quickly in 2020, between 2020 and 2023. So yes, we see not only the rollback and the pullback, we see folks who are moderating positions on hold, putting scholarships, fellowships, and the like on hold. But we also see those who are engaging in internal pressure inside institutions, using the same talking points from one institution to another to push back on the DEI training that's being brought into their corporate, their philanthropic, or their university settings. And so we shouldn't be surprised by this, but we should take different approaches to make sure that the work is sustained. And I think think this is part of what we'll try to talk about at Webster University. What are some of the approaches that we can take to make sure that our transformations of institutions are more sustainable? And one of the things that I'll share is that I believe that the internal pressure and grassroots orientation makes things much more sustainable than responses to external pressures and public relations concerns.
Which is one of my last questions, but you've made me think of it now, which is why training young people is so important, and what happens at the Alex Haley farm, which I so want to go.
Why, come on, open invitation.
Why that is just so crucial in this, has always been, but certainly now in this day and age. And you and I were speaking briefly before we started recording about Joy Reid's book about Medgar and Medgar Evers and the NAACP. Well known that there was a disconnect when high school and college students wanted to become involved and did get involved and began protesting. And the NAACP from New York is saying, Medgar, that's not what we're paying you for.
Yeah.
But they were bailing young people out, but they did not like it. Yeah. And so where are we today with sort of this intergenerational support or lack thereof, understanding or lack thereof, and young people saying, we don't need you. We are going to do what we want to do, what we know we need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, if we pay attention to history, we recognize there's no such thing as a young person. They're just movement age.
Wow.
The most transformative movements on the face of the globe have always been led by what we call young people. I'm a preacher, so I'll just say, right, this thing that we call a Christian movement was started by a youth pastor by the name of Jesus and a bunch of teenagers that we call disciples. I remember growing up seeing students standing in front of tanks at Tiananmen Square. We hear the stories of those in the civil rights era and movement, and if we pay attention to folks like James Baldwin, we recognize that he committed to folks like Stokely Carmichael, that all his work would be about creating space for them. And so I think this is the work of this moment, as it is in every moment. You ask about Alex Haley Farm. Interestingly enough, this is the 30th anniversary. This year's the 30th anniversary of Children's Defense Fund acquiring Alex Haley Farm, Alex Haley's final home in Clinton, Tennessee. Also the location of one of the most devastating and violent integrations of schools in the country with the Clinton 12. And that is the place where we engage in training young people in servant leadership, intergenerational servant leadership to serve in our CDF Freedom Schools, but also the place where we began to plant something years ago in the that we call the Ella Baker Child Policy Training Institute. It was started by young people in an expression called the Black Student Leadership Network. It was our effort to organize and to train young people on college campuses across the country, teach them how to cut issues, how to understand public policy, and to put them to work on these issues in their community. And frankly, that's the beginning of our Freedom Schools. It was the first organizing project of these young people, which, by the way, has some local connections. So like Sean Joe, who's over at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University, was in that core of young people in the National Steering Committee 30 years ago.
Wow.
So I say this to say there are these connections to how movement is initiated, but also how movement is sustained. And so I'm excited that we've restarted at the Children's Defense Fund this Black Student Leadership Network, that we continue to train 1,500 college students every year in community organizing, orientation of movement, and servant leadership, because these leadership ladders and lattices are the pipeline for making sure we can respond to these moments as we see them come up in our lives. We don't know when we'll have these kinds of uprising, these flashpoints. So we've got to continue to pour into leaders to make sure that they're ready for them. I'll stop with a really quick story. There was at the largest early convening for Black Lives Matter in Ohio, everybody realized that, yeah, we're young, but, there are kids here. So, we programmed for ourselves, but what are we going to do with these kids? On the moment, on spec, on spot, they decided to organize a freedom school. Why? Because there were so many, they knew across the country, so many of them, indigenously organized, responding to this moment, had been trained through freedom schools with CDF across the country, not all at the same time, but they all knew the orientation. They knew the cheers. They knew the chants. They knew the entire curriculum. So they were able to put it up together to take care of their kids on site while they did this movement work, because they had all been trained in this expression. And so I think this training arm, this ongoing effort has to continue to be there. And it's not just about CDF. It's the importance of things like here, the BOSS program, Black Organizers Summer School that Action St. Louis is running, the importance of the kinds of fellowship that folks like Metropolitan Congregations United are providing here. So this training that continues and the youth counts for the NAACP, all of these things are important for sustaining movement because of the one of the great corrections I got from one of my mentors here in St. Louis, Mike Jones. Mike Jones. Mike,
you don't want a correction from Mike Jones, but if you get it,
you hold on to it. I gave this talk. And I was talking about the importance of why we do this work. I do this work for my children. I do this work so my sons don't have to struggle. And Mike came up to me after the thing. He said, that was good. That was good. It was good. He said, except for that last part. I said the last part. And by this time, I'm feeling good. I thought I had a nice little riff.
People applauded.
He was like, that's right. Yeah, that last part. He said, look, if you're raising your son to think that he won't have to struggle, then you're setting him up for failure. So the struggle continues. So you do this work so you can hand him the struggle.
Wow.
Not so he doesn't have to struggle.
Mine are 24 and 28. You the struggle.
Look,
I am handing you this. I'm writing it down for real.
Look, I remember it, Mike. I remember it.
Yes. Yeah. So my mother just turned 88, and we're grateful.
Yeah.
And she used to say to me a lot that she did not think that she did right by us. She felt like she had failed.
Wow.
And then by the same token, she would say, now don't blame me. Now you're grown now. Don't blame me. And I think a lot of parents, no matter their strata, may feel like they are failing. Now that's parents. We talk government and policy.
Yeah.
Are we failing, continuing to fail Black children?
Yeah. There's so much promise and potential and power in Black children. So much creativity and brilliance. And there are barriers in front of them, right? So we look and the reality is you're more likely to be poor in this country if you're under the age of 5. If you're under the age of 5 and you're Black and you're in the South, that is the triple whammy. And so there are ways in which this indicator of our success, which is the value of the well-being of our children, demonstrates that we are failing. We have, and I think some of that is tied to, and I'll keep going, right? The number one indicator of cause of death for those under the age of 18 in America is guns. We know what to do about these things.
Right.
In 2021, we expanded the child tax credit. We cut child poverty in half in 1 year. It was a public demonstration project of population scale. And in 2021, we also couldn't hold on to it, such that we reverted back to what we had before. And so child poverty doubled in 2022. So these are things that we know better and we don't do better. So in that sense, yes, we're absolutely failing our children and
our children, not just Black children.
That's right. Our children, period, point blank. All children are being failed by the adults who fail to hold on to and to grasp all 3 prongs of the global children's rights movement, right? So we believe it and it's almost, right, these 3 prongs we should remember easily. It is as if a Baptist preacher came up with them because he used alliteration, right? Right. Provision, right? Making sure that young people have all the things that they need. When it comes to school, that includes things that we learned about in the pandemic. Hey, let's just make sure that everybody at school gets to eat a free lunch. We recognize that young people need nourishment in order to learn. We also learned in the pandemic that if we use universal free school meals, it saves the district money because they don't have to discriminate, and it saves the kids the shame of having to go in that other line. Making sure that they have all their needs met, provision. Second, making sure that they are protected. We're going to work to end child abuse and neglect. Make sure that young people have healing resources and adults in their lives and have a permanent home from which to launch from. Now, where we ultimately fail is this last piece, is participation. Young people should have voice in policies, issues that impact them. This is the 3-pronged kind of global children's rights movement takes all three. And this last one is the one where we have replaced, and this will be nervous, make some people nervous on this one. We have replaced parental voice with children's voice. What do I mean?
Right.
We have decided, even though we know better, that parents' voices should and can always stand up on behalf of children's rights and best interest. And that's just not the case. It's not the case first because it's not equitable. I tell people all the time, in my house, there are 4 children. Now there are 3 that are school age. There are only 2 votes for the school board.
Yeah.
In the house next door to mine, there are no children of school age. There are 2 children, none of school age, but there are 2 votes for the school board.
Right.
In the other house, right. I say this to say, if there are 3 children in my house who are impacted by the school board, why aren't there 3 votes or at least a number of votes that represent and reflect that? Now, this sounds really kind of crazy, like young people having representation on school board voting, until you recognize that in places like Tacoma Park, Maryland, 16-year-olds have been voting for municipal elections for the last decade. Until you look at a place like, we've had the largest expansion of voting rights for young people earlier this year in January in Newark, New Jersey. They began to allow 16-year-olds to vote for things like the school board because they have an interest in those who serve. And so this idea that young people have the capacity to speak up for themselves is a natural extension of the conversation we just had about young people mobilizing and organizing on campuses. Some of them know better, and we should give them the right to speak up in these things. And even policies that don't explicitly speak to the electoral circumstance, young people should have voice in as well. So juvenile justice policies.
Right.
Why are we crafting juvenile justice policies or policies around workforce development without asking young people what kind of workforce supports they need? 16 and 17-year-olds can tell us that.
Right.
So this is one of the things that I'm most excited about, even with the policy work that we're doing, the Children's Defense Fund, is that we're asking young people. There's an organization called the American Youth Policy Forum. We were able to merge the assets of that organization and their programs into the Children's Defense Fund last year. And one of the most significant pieces is they have a youth policy council with young people who serve as consultants on public policy at the federal level. They engage directly around policy advocacy. It's like, yeah, I got a great staff with remarkable experts on that staff.
Right.
And these young people are more experts on their experience, and the legislators need to hear from them. So this is one of the ways that we can do something about areas where we're failing. We can listen to children and young people.
Listen to children. So given the push against the teaching of Black history, where some feel it has a social activist agenda, and the push against DEI, how much more difficult now is it to focus on the needs of Black children and all children?
Yeah. It's a more treacherous path through some of the institutions. And it is a more clear call to action for those of us in community. I came to this work very explicitly, frankly. I took a group of young people from the Ferguson Uprising to Washington, D.C., to a convening of Sojourners in 2015. And that's where I met Mary Wright Edelman. And part of what she talked to me about was freedom schools. She knew the landscape very well. Evidently, there was a time in which St. Louis and Kansas City, especially Kansas City, had the largest density of CDF freedom schools in the country. And she knew that at the time we had one. We had gotten down to one. But she knew other things. She said, no, wait, you're in St. Louis. At Washington University, there's Henry Hampton Archives. Henry Hampton Archives have all the Eyes on the Prize information in them. You can use that to create Sabbath schools on Saturdays in churches. You need to rebuild that freedom school network. She was laying out the path. Right. And so in this moment where others will not teach Black history or where they're challenging the teaching of Black history, it is a call to us to set up networks in the same way she was directing me in the moment in the Ferguson Uprising, saying, hey, young people need to know. And while she's saying this to me, there are also young people who are setting up books and breakfast here. Right? They're saying the same thing. They're not, this is anti-DEI. This is pre-banning books. Young Ferguson activists were setting up books and breakfast so that they could teach Black history in parks here on the north side of St. Louis, right? So we know these things. So maybe it's a helpful call to us. We're excited that our Texas office, Texas is kind of ground zero for this, has been fighting and beating back legislation to ban books there. with the Children's Defense Fund, and there's just more for us to continue to do. Is it more difficult? Yes, and it's a call for us to go back to ourselves in community, yes, for Black people, but also in all of these systems, right? We sit here in St. Louis. St. Louis gifted the nation with the first public kindergarten. I talk to people a lot and say, we have a crisis of public education in this country. Why? Because we have allowed the commodification of public education, like K-12 education, was about the workforce. It was not. It was to prepare an educated citizenry to receive the franchise. If that's the case, how do you remove civics education like what's been happening in Texas? If that's the case, why do we need a national campaign, 50, to get all 50 states to invest in civics education in partnership with folks like Generation Citizen? We have a crisis of mission in public education. So all of this that's about critical race theory or DEI, teaching accurate history, is part of what we need in order to educate people to receive the franchise. And that's about reclaiming what public education is supposed to be about, not the commodification or cogification of our kids. It's about preparing them to be actively engaged citizens. This requires history.
I am quoting here from the website, the CDF envisions a nation committed to equity and justice where children and youth live with dignity, hope, and joy.
Yes.
And joy.
Yes.
One would say with social media today, it's hard to find children who find joy, children who have hope. There's a great deal of hopelessness.
Yeah, indeed. And we're very intentional about that language. We're going to talk about our work in this way, dignity, because we need to affirm children as whole human souls. They're not just staging grounds for adulthood. They are full and complete and should enjoy childhood as a stage in and of itself. Dignity, because there are certain things that we would never accept for ourselves, that we should not allow for our children. Enjoy, because look, if children, this is my metric, not anybody else's, but I got an 8-year-old in my house, and I know that when she is seen and she is safe and she is secure, she will sing and dance like nobody's watching, right? So this is the thing. That's what young people do to express joy. They sing, they dance, they don't feel inhibited, but that means the neighborhood is secure. That means they're not concerned about what people are going to do to them. That means they believe people are acting in their best interests, right? If we can create those conditions, then they will have joy. And part of what we do when we talk about that, when you hear that vision statement, is we're saying it's not about intervening with the child. It's about intervening in the circumstances around the child. It's the best of what we've learned about social determinants of health. Right. You can do all your right behavioral stuff, but if they're not walkable, if you don't live in a walkable neighborhood, it's going to be challenging. If you're afraid to take a walk because the neighborhood's not safe, well, the same thing with our children. And so it's really a call for us to recraft the communities around these children and to reorient the behaviors of the adults who create these conditions. Because without the interventions, young people will sing and dance like nobody's watching.
Social determinants of health aside, the work of the CDF aside, when it was announced that you were going to the Children's Defense Fund, those of us who have studied any amount of history knew who Marion Wright Edelman was.
Yes, Lord.
I mean, venerable figure, historic figure. And I remember thinking, first I thought, we're losing him. But then I was happy for you, and I thought they couldn't have found a better person. Talk about the thought process of stepping into those shoes and into that historic role.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, I decided really early on, so I'd had the opportunity to work with Ms. Edelman for a number of years through Freedom Schools and some of the religious organizing work that was happening at CDF. And so I had a sense of her, and that was probably good because, like, if I just had an idea of her, then I would have engaged in this way.
Those are different, the idea of her and the sense of her.
Yeah, she was a human person. I had pictures of her with my kids, right? This is the real thing. And so a sense of her heart and her passion, and had a sense of the organization. And so a couple of things I was really clear about. Number one, she wore different kind of shoes. right? She ain't a stiletto person. She wear flats so she can move, taking walks every day, even to this day. And so I knew that it would be something where it wouldn't be an attempted replacement in any way. And the work that she had done was so significant that work had been done, and it was time to do different work. So it was important, and I talked to the staff a lot about us carrying her shoes together, not anybody trying to fill them. But the other thing about that is to say that part of my work and my sense of call and vocation in this moment is to extend the legacy, the institutional legacy of one of America's greatest prophets is what I consider her. And that institutional legacy is that Children's Defense Fund. She has remarkable children who are doing great things, grandchildren now who are doing great things. Part of our job is to say, if we believe, and this may be challenging for some people, but I believe the scriptures that the poor shall never cease out of the land, that this work needs to extend. And so while we honor and celebrate our 50th anniversary last year, our job is to make sure that this organization has enough sustainability and strength to thrive, to create containers for young people to grow for another 50 years and beyond. And so I've really oriented my eyes toward making sure there's a healthy and strong institutional container to hold the work for the long term, to create space for those who will come after, to recraft it in ways that need to respond to those moments as well. So it's a different work.
I love it that she's in flats, because when you see photos of her, you see she truly is in flat shoes.
That's right.
I love what you said at Howard University recently. Jesus is not too busy for desperate parents and impoverished children.
Now,
does that imply that we act like we're too busy?
Well, I was preaching from this text in Mark chapter 10, where I'm not going to talk about our churches today. Well, I did there, but the disciples seemed to believe that Jesus was too busy. There's this passage where the disciples are standing between Jesus and these children who Jesus ultimately takes and blesses and suggests that the whole kingdom he's been preaching is about these children. And so it really is a call in the continuum of work. One of the things I'm most excited about here, I'm a trained pastor. I pastored for 10 years in this community. So CDF has 30 years worth of work with religious institutions. And so we do a good amount of faith-related organizing, and we do a lot of work with students. So Howard Chapel is like the perfect intersection of that, at Andrew Rankin Chapel. So what we were really doing was talking about the need for religious folks to turn their attentions to two realities. Number one, that for Christians, the Jesus movement was a movement of and about children, right? When you listen to that text closely and when you pay attention to the fact that the disciples were all teenagers, all except for Peter. So this is a children's movement. And in many ways, our churches don't orient themselves to children, don't give young people voices. And if we don't do it in the life of our core institutions, then we're not going to advocate for it in the world. And so it was a call back to ourselves to say that these young people are critically important. They are precious in the eyes of God. They're made in the image and likeness of God. And so we have a responsibility there. And it was a way to try to get people to understand more than child advocacy ministry. But we're doing some really exciting work with congregations around the country about crafting and constructing theologies of child well-being. So what do you believe about children and God? What do you believe about who Jesus is in relation to these children? What do you believe about the church's responsibility to children? Because we think, we can train you how to do advocacy on behalf of kids, but if your theology at its core subordinates their humanity, then you're not going to do it in a vital and vibrant way. And
not a complete way.
And so we're working with a couple of cohorts across the country of congregational leaders, pastors, lay leaders, to help them to contextualize their own theologies of child well-being based on what they're hearing in their communities.
Which it makes me also then wonder, not one of my questions, but I knew you would bring up things that the ultimate follow-up man, that it's about children. It's not just about the womb.
That's right. Yeah. If you're committed to life.
Right.
Life is on both sides of the womb. If you're committed to life, then you affirm the reality of the agency of mothers who make decisions about their bodies, make decisions about their ability to care for the children they already have. For years, this has actually been an interesting kind of inflection point for us at Children's Defense Fund. For years, CDF didn't take a position on a woman's right to choose, even though we had deep roots in the women's movement, had been advanced by that. But with the Dobbs decision, around a clinic that was right around the corner from our Jackson, Mississippi office. And with the call to solidarity around that, we really had to wrestle with this reality. And one of the things we found, there's a study called the Turnaway Study, I think it's out of UCLA. What we found is that women who present and consider the option for reproductive justice and agency over their own bodies, they tend to have other children. And those who are turned away from being able to exercise the right to choose actually have children that end up living in poverty longer because they didn't have the ability to care for them, right? So some of this is about, if we go back to the theological, I'll start here in the policy. Right here in the policy, if you're really committed to the thriving of families and you believe in the agency of family leaders in our community, matriarchal, matrilineal approach, then you got to give mama the option to do what she believes is best for her children. And we know that sometimes that's an economic decision. But also, if we believe generally in human dignity, then we can't make decisions for other people.
Period.
About their lives and about their bodies. And so if my mama is a whole human soul, if my sister's a whole human soul, then she is given free will and agency, and she should be able to exercise that. And as she does so, our belief is that what is best for all children will come forward from trusting mama to make those decisions.
And I have struggled for decades with the thought that there's a focus on one aspect of the reproductive journey.
Yeah.
And then I don't want to fund early childhood education, and I don't want to fund free lunch, and I don't want to fully fund even HBCUs. There's so many things that a particular party decides not to do in the name of, that we would say, the well-being of children and families.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I don't care that black women are twice as likely to have issues with childbirth, that their children are twice as likely to die in the first year of life. That, like, we don't care about the momnibus bill, but we care about pro-life expression. So no, we've got to be committed to life over a full course.
You also spoke in Chicago, one of my favorite cities, and you were discussing the intersection of faith, politics, and social change, and we recall the split in the Black church and the civil rights movement, that some preachers were like, no, we are not doing that. I'm talking about Jesus over here. I am not talking about the right to vote.
Yeah.
And maybe, there is still a split today in all churches, that some do not want to talk about Black Lives Matter, black or white, don't want to talk about that. So talk about the intertwining of the three that we believe has really always existed.
Yeah. We just got some bad education on some of this stuff. Like, number one, we talk about the separation of church and state, and we believe it's about protecting the state from the church. It's really about protecting the church from the state. So it's not that church leaders, faith leaders shouldn't have something to say about public affairs, about social interactions. The reality is every faith has something to say about politics. The definition I got about politics undergrad at Xavier University was politics is who gets what, when, where, and why. Right? It's about social interactions, and much of what we talk about in the life of the church is about social interactions. To whom do we have responsibility, and what is that responsibility? That's politics. And so being able to talk about that is well within the realm of faith communities. And we know that the long history of support for advancing policy that comes out of the Black church for the Black community is something that needs to be sustained. And so part of what we've got to do is be able to talk to people about what our faith has to say about care for the poor. What does our faith have to say about peace and justice? What does our faith have to say about making sure people are fed? And teaching those things, framing those things, is the work of churches, synagogues, and mosques across the country. Now, explicit endorsements, that's a choice. Right. And this is, I learned this right here in St. Louis. The choice point is this. There's no legal, people going to check me on this. There's no legal constraint from a church, synagogue, or mosque endorsing candidates for office.
Okay.
there's an IRS rule.
Yes. Yes.
Right? So you can endorse. That just means your people can't write off their contributions to you, right? So it impacts your business model.
Right.
But it's a critical choice. I'm not suggesting people make that choice. But policy education is something that's fully within the realm of outreach work of any church, synagogue, or mosque. Making sure people are clear, legislative education, make sure people are clear about the impact on these things and the connection to their faith. This is actually our work, right? And so it's not about whether you can do that work or not. It's about whether you're up to it. And so I think part of the challenge for faith leaders is to make sure they get up to doing the work and doing the homework to make the connections between the religious teaching and the real impact in the world, to mobilize people to have voice in systems that they have responsibility for, and to make connections. I'll make one really quick one. One of the things I used to talk about at St. John's, in the fall, October situates itself very well, because most congregations are talking about stewardship, right? This we're going to talk about the budget, we're going to talk about stewardship and all that. It's usually financial, but it's also right before the elections.
Right.
When we talk to people about what the tithe was and what it provided for, and when we go to the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, it provided for a lot of the same things our taxes care for today.
Right. The lights.
It was about the public trust. It was about caring for all the people. And so good stewardship calls for you not just to give to the life of the congregation, the synagogue, or the mosque, and to show up at the church meeting to make sure it's being allocated well, but to show up at the polls to make sure that people who are allocating what would have been that same resource are allocating it well. And so it's an expression of your faith to vote. It's an expression of your commitment to a bigger and better world, to advocate. This is what it means to be faithful. It's not somehow trading in a politic that is beyond your responsibility.
Far too many people are in an uncomfortable space, I take it, that they don't feel I'm just supposed to be evangelizing and get you to profess your faith and get you into heaven, or invite you here.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be inviting you here to my church on Sunday.
Yeah.
But voting?
Yeah, I've come to realize one of two things is true. Either I'm a different kind of Christian and kind of weird. But there are a bunch of us out here.
There are a bunch of us out here
who believe in the politics of Jesus in this way. Or Christians in America, I quote my big brother Otis Moss III on this, there may not be anything wrong with Christianity, just the wrong Christians got the mic. The people
that knocked me back in my seat.
Yeah, the folks that we allow to speak on behalf of Christian faith, the folks that we center and normalize as a Christian perspective, seem to be far afoot from what we see operating in the ministry of Jesus in the New Testament for those of us who are Christians. And so I would say I had to rock with Otis on this one. I think the wrong people have the mic, and it's time for others to redefine what it means to be faithful to one who proclaimed a vision of community that was a critique of empire rather than align with empire.
Before I let you go, I have to ask you about fatherhood. Yes, I knew it would elicit that response. And about the lovely LaToya.
Yes.
I follow you on Facebook, of course, and we watched your children. Well, we watched them come into the world.
Yeah, you did.
And we watched them grow up. And I remember looking at the college visits, and he's suddenly taller, way taller. How much taller than you?
Well, that's the thing. My 15-year-old is the one who's taller than me.
Not the college
No,
student.
not my college student. I got an 18-year-old son. So first, my wife is wonderful. LaToya is absolutely marvelous. She is fully engaged in community, helped us to transition as a family. So she's engaged with a dental practice there in the St. Louis, there in the D.C. community, in many ways serving a similar populations of need that she served here with Children's Hospital and some of the FQHCs here in St. Louis. So that's exciting. But also she has done the great work of helping us to make the transition by creating space for all of the children. So my oldest, Starsky, is in his first year at Howard University. He decided not to go too far from home. He is on campus. Tell people he went far enough away that we can't sneak up on him. But he's close enough to home that he can keep his room and he can bring bring some laundry, right?
Yeah.
My 15-year-old Dallas is a remarkable creative artist who's taught himself art during the context of the pandemic, using so positive use of social media, YouTube, and otherwise to teach himself visual art. So expressing himself creatively. 13-year-old Mason just finished one basketball season. He's still in another basketball season, and tracking his progress on TikTok as an undersized guard headed to the D1. So he's declared this as a 13-year-old, and he's working toward it with all his Kobe quotes and commitment to hard work. And our 8-year-old Amber, whose feet never touch the ground except for when she's dancing with daddy and mama wrapped around different fingers of hers. She is really our kind of expression and reminder and grounding in this work. Like, we do it so that every single young person has the opportunities that she has to, frankly, zone out and not have to think about it. And so many young people grow up with those concerns and do not grow up with the kind of space that ours do. And so we feel blessed in that regard and obligated to make sure that it's available to so many others.
She and I have something in common, that we have 3 older brothers.
And
the joy the pride that I have always had, that I have 3 older brothers, I know she has as well. I've seen the photos of them together, and I know they're super protective, and I know she feels like she is the princess.
Yeah, she is. And soon, she hadn't realized this yet, soon she will also appreciate that they will all be gone before she gets to high school. But no, she loves her crew. She loves her big brothers.
Well, and quick story, something happened to me in high school once, and my brother came home from college. To roll up on somebody, and say that will never happen again.
These are the kind of things we teach.
Yes.
So gratitude for him for the example, and I hope mine are listening. Yeah.
Did you cry when that one went to college? What was that like for you?
I didn't cry, but I've had my moments. Well, what I was most surprised by was the care with which the other 3 children kind of looked out for him. I didn't know the work that he was doing in the house.
Really? Of
care and nurture and transition until I had a chance to talk to my second oldest about how he understood his role changing. So he
was big brother communicating, this is what's happening, this is who you are now.
That's right. And so that's a unique kind of care. I found it out when I had to go and get something out of the room for Starsky and take it to his campus. He had forgotten something. And so I go in and out of the district every day. And so I took it and I left his door open. When I came home, they had closed it. And I didn't realize, I started asking, I said, I realized this, like, it's important to them that his door is closed.
Interesting.
Because when we left, we said our goodbyes at home. We had a family prayer, had some moments of affirmation, and then Mom and I drove him to campus to move him in. Well, what we didn't know was they had their own circle once we left in his room. And after they had their circle in the room, they closed the door. And it was only for him to return to open it. And so the kinds of bonds and care, not just the brilliance, but the sincerity of young people when they have their own space is a witness to me. Right? It's a witness, not only my own children, but those that I've come into contact with in this community in St. Louis. And so I carry that kind of care, intention, humanity with me into this work. And that's what I feel called to serve. That's what we're trying to serve as CDF. And frankly, what we're inviting people to serve with us is that kind of joy.
I love that so much. Can you leave us your former colleagues and friends, and we're still your friends?
Yeah. I hope so.
But can you leave us in St. Louis with some advice on how we move forward from all the different challenges that we are facing in this region? And we know there's great work going on. There are many people doing many things, but what's your advice to St. Louisans to progress?
Yeah. A few things. I think, number one, there are those who would say don't look back. I say yes, absolutely look back in moments of Sankofa. right? There are wonderful things that we have done in this community, things that we have taught other people in this community that we ought to look back and carry forward with us. The essence of them we ought to carry forward and carry them forward in love. And I see a lot of that as the kinds of investments that have been made in young people, the way we've decided to reframe some of the issues and challenges. Not every community, and we, I had opportunity to talk to other communities about what did you do with your racialized flashpoint. Not everybody took the time we took to listen to people, to create space for people. That is a unique social intervention and innovation that we engaged in. And so we ought to pat ourselves on the back for that. We ought to lift up ways in which we have sought to hold one another accountable. Not just the use of the Ferguson Commission report, but also the People's Plan and One STL in different kinds of ways to say we engage in the work to plan together and we hold each other accountable to what we have said. I think that exercise has to continue, and it's time to renew that work. 10 years is a long time. And so a number of things have changed. I think 2018 was the last time Forward Through Ferguson did a check-in on a report on the report, if you will. So it's time to reflect with accountability and talk about what we've done, not just in a narrative sense, but in a detailed sense. What did we actually accomplish? And then say, hey, let's invest in refresh and say this moment calls for different conversations. We've been through a whole pandemic. There's new work that we have to do. Let's listen together for what that work is that we have to do going forward. And let's be clear in it all to put children and young people at the center of the conversations, not just about them, but with them. Hear what they have to say, hear their cries, and then hold people accountable around them. I don't want to have the occasion of what I had last year. I'll close with this. I came here for what has become an inspiring mobilization in my own ministry and advocacy over the course of the years, Missouri Child Advocacy Day. Hundreds of advocates from across the country come and descend on the Capitol to talk about children's issues. And last year I had the occasion to come back for that, to be a part of that, to be able to speak at that rally. What I did know was when I was traveling into the city overnight the night before, there was a long debate well into the night over whether there would be gender-affirming care for trans young people in this state. And so we came to talk about early childhood education in the morning, and we couldn't find anybody because they were tired from being on the floor trying to keep care from young people the night before. Let us not live in that contrast, right, of just that 24 hours. Let's live in a full affirmation of young people and their whole humanity. Let's mobilize as much around all these issues and across course as we can. And once we hear what they have to say, let us understand that their cries are our call. We've got to actually do something about it. I believe all of the capacity for that is here. And so I invite my friends and neighbors to do it and say this very clearly. I ain't going nowhere for real. We're going to do this together. And so I look forward to doing it. And CDF looks forward to doing it with all the folks who are willing to put their hands to this work here in St. Louis and Missouri.
I ain't going nowhere for real.
Ain't going nowhere for real.
That's on a T-shirt. Before the end of the day, that is on a T-shirt. Reverend Starsky Wilson, it is a joy. It is an honor to sit with you and chop it up again.
Thank you for having me here. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for all the ways that you continue to hold St. Louis in these real conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for joining us on another episode of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. Remember the 3 or 4 S's. They are to subscribe. All you got to do is hit the button. To share this podcast. It's very easy. You can share it via email. You can share it in a text message to someone. And to say something, go to 9pbs.org/Listen St. Louis and leave us a comment. We'll be back next week with another episode of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel.
Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center, the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and Orvin and Latrice Kimbrough.